This is Guns and Butter.
So who are the neoconservatives? I think it's pretty clear today that they are, most of them are dual citizens, Israeli citizens, not all of them, of course. They are not different in essence from Benjamin Netanyahu. And the neocons, David Wurmser, for example, and Richard Pearl, have written reports for Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is the same team, this is the same group. The only difference is that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud people are Israelis and officially heads of states in Israel, whereas the neocons are their agents within the United States.
I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Today on Guns and Butter, Laurent Guyenot. Today's show, 9/11, a double false flag? Laurent Guyenot is an author, researcher, and journalist. His current research focuses on the religious and civilizational backgrounds of Zionist geostrategy. His books include Jesus and John the Baptist, Historical Inquiry into a Legendary Encounter, Fairy Death, an Anthropology of Medieval Fantasy, and translated into English, JFK to 9/11, 50 Years of Deep State, and From Yahweh to Zion, Jealous God, Chosen People, Promised Land, Clash of Civilizations. Today we discuss his latest article, The 9/11 Double Cross Theory, Pentagon Inside Job, World Trade Center Israeli Job, that analyzes the September 11th attacks as two separate but related events. Laurent Guyenot, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Bonnie.
Your analysis of the false flag attacks of September 11th, 2001 is quite unique. In your article, The 9/11 Double Cross Theory, Pentagon Inside Job, World Trade Center Israeli Job, you write that, quote, the attack on the Pentagon and the attacks on the Twin Towers were different in many ways. What are some of the differences between the two separate attack locations on the same day that you're referring to?
Well, this idea has been in my mind for a long time, and not only in my mind. I think quite a few people have sensed that there are fundamental differences between the Pentagon attack and the World Trade Center attacks. And also it connects with the question of who did it, Inside Job or Israeli Job. There are two main theories going around, but of course none of them are completely wrong. So in trying to figure out, what really happened and how those two attacks connect, I think one important dot, that I somehow could connect with the rest was when I saw Barbara Honegger's conference. She has a 3-hour conference on video, and she makes the important point that the Pentagon was a military target and the World Trade Center is a civil target. And that's one fundamental difference. And she explains, which I think is very, very insightful, that only the Pentagon attack could be used as an act of war and could really fit the pattern of Pearl Harbor. We've heard so much about the Pearl Harbor, the new Pearl Harbor. And what she said is that the new Pearl Harbor was the Pentagon attack, because the World Trade Center attack was basically, of course, much more dramatic, but in essence was not very different from the 1993 bombing of the Twin Towers. Of course, in 1993, none of the towers went down, but basically it was a terror attack, which could not, legally give a pretext for invading a sovereign country. Anyway, I felt that's an important point. And of course, there are other important differences, which everyone can be easily aware of. First of all, if you look only at the Pentagon attack, it's pretty simple. It's just one plane hijacked and that crashed into the Pentagon, and the damage to the Pentagon looks, quite reasonably consistent with the idea of a plane going into the Pentagon, even though I don't believe a plane went into the Pentagon, or at least not a commercial airplane. But basically, it's kind of reasonable. So it could be quite an appropriate pretext for starting a war against Afghanistan. On the other hand, the Twin Towers, the demolition of the Twin Towers and Tower 7 is very different in the sense that it's completely irrational in a sense, and it's also very traumatic. So there is a very different effect. That's why 9/11 in most people's mind is, the destruction of the Twin Towers. They think of the World Trade Center. People don't really think anymore about the Pentagon attacks. Because they have seen so many pictures of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers and the towers exploding floor by floor. So that created a traumatic event, which put American people and people worldwide into a special kind of mind frame to program them to accept a global war. So my theory is that, those two events were organized basically, they were planned by different people, or at least in different stages. And then I'm trying to find out why did those two things happen the same day. And the answer, I mean, it's just a theory, it's just an hypothesis to try to, to move on and make more and more sense of this thing. I came up with the idea of the double cross, or the hijacked conspiracy, I call it.
Were there any other obvious differences that you could mention between these two different locales on September 11th?
Well, yeah, recently I realized, for example, that one interesting point, if you look at the planes which allegedly crashed into the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. I say allegedly, and I don't want to get too much into the question of what planes or how many planes or this kind of thing. But let's look at we were told that the plane that crashed into the Pentagon left from Dulles Airport in Washington. So in fact, the whole event was kind of taking place within Washington area. That's an interesting point. And then when you look at the two planes that crashed into the Twin Towers, they left from Boston. And, there is this has been known for a long time and pointed out by people like Christopher Bolin and Michael Collins Piper and others, that in the Boston Logan Airport subcontracted its security and passenger management to a company that is located in Israel. So that's one detail that's also point to a difference of signature. And many people today are very aware that the World Trade Center event has Israel's fingerprint all over the place, starting with the fingerprints of Larry Silverstein and many people around him. I call them Cyanim. I feel, they were complicit, at least, maybe even more than complicit to the event, and they did that for Israel. But if you look at the Pentagon, it's a little bit more difficult to imagine that Israel or the Israeli deep state with all their infiltrated agents could have control the situation to the point of organizing the event in the Pentagon. So I'm not saying, I've read some comments saying I ignore the presence of the neocons, crypto-Zionists within the Pentagon. So no, I'm not saying that Israel did not contribute to the event in the Pentagon. What I imagine is that under the leadership of Donald Rumsfeld, the neocons could maybe pull a group of insiders within the Pentagon or within the national security state, as we can call a deep state, whatever, to organize a Pentagon attack, but without making them aware that, there would be on the same day another much bigger event on the World Trade Center, which would trigger a response much bigger than what the Pentagon insiders had in mind. So my hypothesis is that there were two different plans coming from two different groups. It's difficult to really, separate those two groups, but I think it's possible to some extent. And one group was interested in creating a false flag attack to justify the invasion of Afghanistan. And they had different purposes for, overthrowing the Taliban there. And another group, basically Israeli loyalists, were interested in something much bigger. And so they created an event which was much bigger and which would be big enough to pull the United States into World War IV, as one of the neocons or two of the neocons called for. They were calling for a new world war in the Middle East. So in this sense, I say, well, the 9/11 was both an inside job and an Israeli job. But of course, since the Pentagon event is much smaller than the World Trade Center event, we can say maybe it was 1/10 inside job and 9/10 Israeli job. So it's still an Israeli job in my vision of things.
You mentioned Logan Airport in Boston and how the security there was controlled by Israeli companies. Was that a different situation at the airport in Washington, D.C.? Do we know?
Well, as far as I know, there is no, this company called Huntley, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Huntley USA Corporation. It was bought by International Consultant on Targeted Security, ICTS. And if you check ICTS, you'll see the Israeli connection there. I don't think they were in the Washington airport. So I don't think there is a trace of Israel in Washington Dulles Airport. But of course, that's a detail if you consider that none of these planes took off anyway. So I read a comment saying, well, none of these planes took off, so it doesn't matter who was doing the security. Well, I think it matters in the sense that even if none of these commercial airplanes took off, the airports themselves had to create the record that they took off with the passenger list, and they had to fabricate proof or evidence that these planes existed. So still complicity was needed within these airports. And so it's easy to imagine that in the Washington area, there is maybe a proximity that is easier for Washington people, Pentagon people, to have some control in the Washington airport. But in Boston, somehow it seems that the Mossad was involved. All of these planes, of course, as most people know, probably were injected into the war games that were going on that very day. So to some extent, at least, they were virtual flights. But, it seems to me plausible, at least, I'm not, that's not a proof, but it seems plausible that there were two different people injecting different planes into the war games. But that's just a detail, as I say. That's not the main, of course, the main piece of evidence to distinguish those two events. I think the main point, I think, is to realize the difference in scale. The Pentagon event was a small event. It would not have changed the world. It was just big enough to create a pretext to invade Afghanistan and nothing else. It would never have been enough to create a shock within the public opinion for anything more than invading Afghanistan. And it was not difficult to convince the American people that we need to invade and overthrow the Taliban, because for years, the Taliban have been portrayed as absolutely satanic. Everybody hated the Taliban, so it was not, they didn't need more than this event on the Pentagon to create an act of war and a pretext, a new Pearl Harbor. But the event of World Trade Center had a very different scale, not only in what happened, but more importantly in the images that Americans saw over and over again. And it's very interesting to realize that, there are basically no images of the plane hitting the Pentagon. There's this security camera which doesn't show any plane at all. We see an explosion. But basically, there were no traumatic images. Whereas on the World Trade Center, we can see how the mainstream media played a huge role in showing over and over these pictures, these incredibly traumatic pictures. I mean, everybody who saw those pictures live on the day of 9/11 and the days after, and again and again and again for weeks on, it created a huge shock. And that shock in itself was enough to change the world, to change completely American public opinion. Within a few days, the image of Israel was completely inverted, and Americans felt, completely empathic to the Israelis and suddenly viewed their struggle against the Palestinians as part of the war on terror. So, this created an incredibly positive impact in terms of the relationship between the United States and Israel. And actually, in my article, I quote an article which I think Michael Collins Piper was the first to report this article. It came out on September 11, 2001. It was published around 1 p.m. New York Times, and it was written by George Friedman on his website Stratfor. And he said, the big winner today, intended or not, is the state of Israel. And then he goes on to explain why this was the very day of 9/11, in the early afternoon, just a few hours after the towers collapsed. And he could see, and it's very interesting that he said the big winner today, intended or not. What does he mean? Intended or not? Does he know something? It's very interesting. And then he goes on to say, the image of Israel was getting really bad. Americans were getting really fed up with Israel, and were very sympathetic toward the Palestinians because, the new Intifada had been started, and suddenly, from within a day, this completely changed. And this was not because of the Pentagon attacks, obviously. The number of dead also is very different. In the Pentagon, only 125 people were reported dead, killed in the Pentagon. That's not counting the people who supposedly died in the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. But in the Twin Towers, it was announced in the beginning that 4,000 or 5,000 or maybe bigger numbers even were announced, and then they settled on a little bit more than 2,000 dead. But, the scale is completely different. So it seems to me that there's a problem to explain these differences. If the purpose of 9/11 was to create this traumatic shock, then why did they need the Pentagon? Well, one answer would be, well, they needed to hit a military target. That's a possibility, of course. But so anyway, I developed this theory. It's only a theory, an hypothesis that I put forward and see what people think about it. And it seems like it can be helpful. I'm not saying there's still a lot of mysteries, but so that's why we need the working hypothesis.
You write about two competing groups within the U.S., so-called deep state. How would you characterize these competing groups? How would you distinguish the American deep state from a Zionist network?
Well, I'm not really a specialist of American deep politics, but since I've been working on 9/11 and the history, the deep history of America, going back to Kennedy and going back to World War II, it seems that the history of what we can call the national security state, that is basically what we can also call the deep state, and what I define as the secret or semi-secret, semi-invisible government of the empire. Because America is a country with a dual nature. It's a democracy on the domestic level, and all these domestic issues are the big parts of issues in every election. But all the issues of foreign and military policies are completely out of control of the American people, basically. It's not difficult to sense that all the decisions are not made by the elected people. Whether it's the president or the congressman, we have this deep state, and this deep state is not very much concerned by domestic policies, but is completely in control of foreign policy. So it's the government of the empire, as opposed to the government of the democracy. And this deep state is not it's not an official entity, so it's difficult to define. But I think everybody would agree that in 1947, under Truman, the National Security Act really boosted this entity, or maybe even created this entity. This was the time when the CIA was created, the National Security Council with the National Security Advisor and so on. And so all these people who were organized to somehow make the big decisions on foreign policy and foreign wars and regime change in Latin America and so on and so on. So who are these people? Well, originally, basically, these people, we can say, if you look at the CIA, for example, the CIA was basically founded, all the leaders, the executive level of the CIA was made of Wall Street lawyers or Wall Street businessmen. So it was a tool for these people who consider that Latin America must be under the control of, how did Kissinger call it, the back door, or whatever. So these people have an interest in controlling the natural resources in Latin America, in keeping cheap oil in the Middle East. They're concerned with this kind of issues. They are imperialist in this sense. They are globalist. In a sense that they don't make much difference between America and the global market. I'm not in their head, but I imagine for them, America is the global empire and the global market. They see America in this way. They're not too concerned with domestic policies. So these people may constitute what we call the imperialist group of people who always have some interest in controlling what's going on in the world and controlling maybe what's going on in Afghanistan. I think most people would agree that one of the most important institution or think tank that represents this kind of people would be the Council on Foreign Relations, because it's one of the oldest and most representative institution of this kind of strategic school. Many heads of states, maybe the majority of people who are, especially in the State Department or in the White House, come from the Council of Foreign Relations, have spent years in the Council of Foreign Relations. Of course, there are many other institutions, and I don't have all of them in mind, but many other, some more secret than the CFR could be mentioned. So we'll talk a little bit more about Brzezinski because he's an important player in these events. But my hypothesis is that these people had an interest in overthrowing the Taliban. It has been explained that the Taliban during the year 2001 were judged to be not good partners for, in particular, the pipelines project by UNOCAL, and so they had to go. At some point, this has been documented, I think, well enough, at some point it was decided that the Taliban had to go. And with the help of the Pakistan, the plan was to install a more American-friendly regime with whom America could deal. And that's why actually Hamid Karzai was put in at the head of Afghanistan, because he had been working actually for UNOCAL. So he was the perfect leader to restore exactly the kind of relationship that the American imperialists want with a country like Afghanistan or in South America. And so these people had an interest in Afghanistan. Did they have an interest in destabilizing Iraq? Well, I think there is absolutely no evidence for that. In fact, there is more evidence that these kind of people were calling for the end of sanctions on Iraq, because these kind of people, what they want is advantageous commercial relationship with any country who has any kind of natural resource. They want to control the market, but they want stability. They don't care to have democracy in Iraq or anywhere else. What they want, rather, is a government with whom they can deal. So, of course, Saddam Hussein was a person, it was quite difficult to deal with Saddam Hussein, but I see no evidence, and actually this point has been made by Marsheimer and Walt in their famous book, The Israel Lobby and American Foreign Policy. There is absolutely no evidence that people in the oil business, for example, wanted to destabilize Iraq. And there is even no evidence at all that these people got anything from the Iraq war, you know. So that came from another group. So now I can try to say how I see this other group.
I'm speaking with author, researcher, and journalist Laurent Guyenot. Today's show, 9/11, a double false flag? I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. I just wanted to have you comment on this, and then we can go on to the other group. You make the very important point that I haven't heard anyone else make, that in fact Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor and CFR member, etc., that Brzezinski was against the invasion of Iraq. Now, I've never heard anyone else make this point, and that's very important. What can you tell us about Zbigniew Brzezinski?
Well, I cannot tell you more than most people who have studied a little bit 9/11 would tell you, but yes, he was. I think I would not be able to quote exactly some interview. I think but basically he was against the Iraq war. He spoke against it. Even, of course, he was already very much against the Iraq war in 1991, or was it 1990, under President H.W. Bush. He spoke, I think it was a United Nations, I believe, very strongly against an international intervention in Iraq. So already at the time, he was very, very outspoken against those who were pushing for the invasion of Iraq. And he supported, President Bush Sr. He supported his decision to just kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait and let Saddam Hussein continue to rule Iraq. He was one of the very few who spoke about Israel in that context, saying that if we destroyed Iraq, then this would encourage Israel to feel quite at ease with developing a stronger weapon, and this would give Israel an unfair advantage. I don't remember his exact words, but he even mentioned that Israel had nuclear weapons, which not so many American politicians are willing to do. So anyway, again in 2001 or in 2002, and certainly in 2003, 2004, and he spoke very clearly about it again in 2007, when I believe there was another push for sending more soldiers into Iraq. He was very much against it, yes. And he kept speaking against it. He said, I quote him, he said very strong words about the Iraq war. He said it was a catastrophe of a huge. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. The war in Iraq. And most people, I tried to check a little bit, and I found that most people around the CFR, of course, Brzezinski, had been kind of a leading member of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. Most people in that organization were against the Iraq war, and even the present director or chairman of the CFR, commenting under my article on the UNS Review, mentioned that he, again, quite recently said that he had always been against the Iraq war. So, of course, not everybody was exactly on the same line, but I think it's quite clear, I think, that most of these people who were globalists were not interested in wars to destroy Iraq or actually any other country. What they wanted is the end of sanctions and the restoration of good trade between these countries. So what's important in the theory that I try to explore is that during 9/11 we see two different events, and after 9/11 we see two different plans or two different scenarios proposed to respond to 9/11. One scenario is, let's go and invade Afghanistan. That's the Brzezinski scenario. Let's go and invade Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, and that's it. because Bin Laden is in Afghanistan, and so we have the legitimacy to do that. But let's do nothing else. And of course, from the very day of September 11th, there was this other group who were very strongly under the leadership of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, whom I count. Maybe we have to talk again about those two people, because they have a very special role. They are not Israelis, of course, but they have always been, I would say, mercenaries of the neocons. And the neocons, for me, are crypto-Zionists. They are psionim, basically. They are people who have infiltrated the highest level of the American administration, but everything they do is basically for Israel. And what they want to do for Israel is, of course, pull the United States into proxy wars that would destroy the enemies of Israel, which are Iraq, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, and Iran, basically, and a few more. So these people, basically, if we want to identify the group that were pushing for the Iraq war, it's very simple. It's the neocons, the neoconservatives. So who are the neoconservatives? I think it's pretty clear today that they are, most of them are dual citizens, Israeli citizens, not all of them, of course. They are not different, in essence, from Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is not American citizen. He's an Israeli citizen, but he spent several decades in the United States as a United Nations ambassador, I think, or different positions. He has been very present on American televisions, on CNN, and the neocons, David Wormser, for example, and Richard Pearl, have written reports for Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is the same team. This is the same group. The only difference is that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud people are Israelis and officially heads of state in Israel, whereas the neocons are their agents within the United States. And so that's the other group. And the story of this group is very well known. They started to gain influence in the 1970s after the Watergate. And they have used these two people, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, as I would say hushers. Cheney and Rumsfeld managed to enter the Ford administration in quite high positions, and then through the back door they brought Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, I think, and other people close to Richard Pearl. Cheney and Rumsfeld, in my view, must be understood as mercenaries of Richard Pearl, basically, for whom they had worked even since the 60s, I think. And so they slowly, little by little, gained more and more power, bringing more and more people into the administration under Reagan. Reagan rewarded the neoconservatives by bringing about 20 of them within his administration. Bush Sr. tried to kick a few out. He didn't like them. Bush Sr. was not a pro-Israeli president. I think he has been very unfairly treated by many people in the dissident movement, because in fact, if you look closely at what he did, the Israelis did not like him at all. He was a friend of the Saudis. He was not a friend of the Israelis at all. So he didn't like the neocons. And of course, Bush Sr. should not be confused with Bush Jr., who was not at all under the influence of his father. That's another story. But anyway, to continue with the neocons, so during the Clinton administration, they created the PNAC, so they were out of the administration, but other crypto-Israelis, of course, were within the Clinton administration. And during that time, the neocons tried to build up their and prepare for the next election, and they created this PNAC, this project for a new American century, which is really, in fact, a project for a new Israeli century. And then they completely dominated Bush Jr.'s administration, thanks to Dick Cheney, who was both Bush campaign director and who put himself, basically Dick Cheney managed. He chose the people to make the government of George Bush Jr. And he chose himself as vice president, of course, before that. And Rumsfeld was in the Pentagon. He brought Wolfowitz, Douglas Files, and all those key people of the neocons. And within the White House, there were a lot of neocons. And in the State Department, Colin Powell was not at all a neocon. And Colin Powell himself was very reluctant. He was finally almost forced and fooled and tricked into calling for the Iraq War. And he publicly said he had been cheated, into this position to call for the Iraq War in front of the United Nations General Assembly. So we see progressively this crypto-Zionist group gaining more and more influence on foreign policy and taking the high ground over the imperialist, but using the imperialist rhetoric and posturing as imperialists themselves. When they create the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, they present it as a way for America to regain its imperial status in the world, But when we see the state of the United States today, and the reputation of America in the world today, we can see that it did not profit at all America. None of these wars profited America in any way. So, in fact, today it can be said that those two groups are maybe a little bit difficult to distinguish at this point, 20 years after 9/11. Because 20 years after 9/11, even the CFR is probably very much infiltrated by Zionists today. And it's probably quite difficult to find any place, any institution of any importance where the Zionists have not gained some strong influence.
You mentioned that Dick Cheney and also perhaps Donald Rumsfeld, that either one or both of them had worked with Richard Pearl before they came into any administration. Do you know in what capacity they were working with Richard Pearl?
Well, actually, they weren't. I made a mistake, but let me try to get this straight. I think they started to be connected very closely to the neoconservative through Richard Pearl in 1974. I don't think they worked together before. Donald Rumsfeld was actually already working for Ford before Ford took over Richard Nixon's presidency. He is the elder of the two. Rumsfeld is, I think, 9 years older than Cheney. So when Rumsfeld joined the White House, he was, I think, chief of staff of President Ford. And then in 1974, he became Secretary of Defense for the first time under Ford. And then he brought in Dick Cheney, who took over the position of chief of staff. And then from that time on, they were always together somehow. And they kind of acted as hushers for the neoconservatives. They brought Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pipes, who were both protégés of Richard Pearl, into the administration through Team B. And Team B, if you remember, was a kind of a parallel CIA somehow that the neoconservatives created in order to bypass the CIA and create alarming reports about the Soviet Union military armaments. And at that time, we have videos of Rumsfeld. We have speeches of him saying, the Soviet Union is rearming and we have to boost up our military capacity and so on. Because the CIA was producing reports saying, well, they are not a threat anymore. So the neoconservatives absolutely wanted the Soviet Union to be a threat because they needed the Cold War, because if there was no Cold War, and that was actually one of the purpose of assassinating Kennedy, I think, because Kennedy wanted to end the Cold War, and if there was no Cold War, there wouldn't be no way to use Egypt and all the Arab states, into the Cold War, and there would be little interest in Israel, either from Soviet Union or from the United States. Of course, I don't understand exactly how it all works, but it seems like Cheney and Rumsfeld have always been used as a connecting link between the neoconservatives and the administration.
I'm speaking with author, researcher, and journalist Laurent Guyenot. Today's show, 9/11, a double false flag? I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Well, how would you characterize the neoconservatives in terms of their philosophy? You have said that the mindset of the Israelis is very biblical. Now, would you apply that characterization to the neoconservatives as well?
Yes, I would. That's one of the main theme of my book, From Yahweh to Zion. I try to show, because I believe it's really an important truth, that Zionism itself is very biblical. It's the biblical plan. And a misunderstanding that I think is preventing a lot of people from understanding that is that they say, no, Zionists are not religious people. Well, it doesn't matter they're religious or not religious, they are biblical. Because for people like the early Zionists, the father of Israel, for example, David Ben-Gurion, he was certainly not very religious, but he was completely 100% biblical. Because the Bible can be read either as a religious book or as a project for the destiny of the Jewish people. So, to understand the mindset of Zionists in general and neoconservatives in particular, we have to step away from this concept of religion. Religious or not religious is not so relevant to understand the Jewish mind in general, actually. But if we try to understand who were the neoconservatives, then the best way is to look at the man they called their mentor, at least the mentor of Irving Kristol and Norman Podorest and many others, Philip Zelikow and Douglas Feith. Most of these people refer to Leo Strauss as their mentor. So I find it very interesting to see that if you go, for example, on Amazon and you look at the books about Leo Strauss, you find books, like portraying Leo Strauss as an American imperialist. There's one book with a big U.S. flag on the cover, and the title is Leo Strauss and the Politics of American Empire. Or you have other books like Leo Strauss and the American Right. And what these authors want to say is that Leo Strauss is an American imperialist. He is the brain of the neocons, because the neocons are American imperialists. But that's not true. That's kind of a false flag in itself. It's a false image of Leo Strauss. And this false image is used both by those who want to praise Leo Strauss. They say, well, look, he's a great American patriot. He loves America so much that he dreams that America rules the world. And it's the same image used by those people who criticize or blame Leo Strauss for all the damage done by the neocons. They say, look, Leo Strauss is the almost like a caricature of the American imperialist. But in fact, if you read, Leo Strauss is notoriously difficult to understand because he has two different levels of teaching. One level is the level of his written books and his public teaching. He was a teacher in the University of Chicago. I don't know, I think he died in the early 70s or late, maybe in 1968, I'm not sure. But he also gave a few conferences, and it was known that he had a circle of insiders, a circle of disciples. And even some of his disciples have said, look, Leo Strauss would say things to us that he would never say publicly or write. But some of those conferences have been, that he gave have been recorded and then later printed. And one very important conference, a conference he gave in the Hillel Institute, I think in 1962, it's called Why We Remain Jews. And if you read that conference that he gave to a Jewish audience, well, you can see very clearly that the real Leo Strauss is not at all an American imperialist. He is what I would call a meta-Zionist. What I mean by a meta-Zionist is a man who thinks Israel, it's good that basically he supports Israel as a state, but he wants to emphasize that Israel's destiny is not to be just a state. Israel is a worldwide community. So Israel has to be not only in Israel, but has to be in the world. And I think he comes close to saying that American Jews must become like a fifth column within America to help Israel reach its destiny. So Leo Strauss, just like David Ben-Gurion, was not at all a religious man. He never spoke about God. And he called, in this conference, he called his Jewish audience, he said, we have to return to the Jewish faith, the faith of our ancestors. But if you read carefully, you can very easily see that what he means is not at all faith in God. It's faith in the destiny, the superior destiny of the Jewish people. So I realized, I wrote one article on the Unz Review called 9/11 was a Straussian coup. Because if you consider that the neocons, or at least the core of the neocons, are Straussians, disciples of Leo Strauss, then 9/11 was a Straussian coup, and that means the whole purpose of 9/11 was to realize the vision of Leo Strauss of Israel being a kind of a double-sided entity with one side of Israel is a state in the Middle East, but Israel is also, and that was the meaning of Israel before 1947. You know, there's all kinds of, I like to quote, for example, this famous front page of the London Daily News, where you had Israel is calling for a global war against Germany, you know. 1933. So what did they mean by Israel at that time? They meant the worldwide communities of Israelites. You know, at that time they would like to refer to Jews as Israelites. Israel as a state did not exist yet. So Israel has two meanings for Jewish people. Still today, you can be an Israeli citizen, or you can be an Israelite living somewhere else, but you are still an Israeli by conviction and by heart. I'm talking here about dedicated Jews who have now become dedicated Zionists. Of course, there are many Jews who don't fit that description at all. But the neocons have gained such an influence over the Jewish community in America, even though they have many enemies, many people would criticize them, they completely dominate. Their voice is absolutely dominant today within the American community.
Does the destruction of so many Middle Eastern countries in the wake of 9/11 resemble anything like the Oded Yinon Zionist plan for the greater Middle East? Is there a connection there with the Oded Yinon plan?
Well, yeah, I think this is the same vision, it shows exactly that this vision of the imperial destiny of Israel, at least the local imperial destiny in the Middle East. Israel is destined for these people to rule the Middle East. In fact, for these people, Israel had no other choice, either to disappear or to dominate the Middle East, which is quite a realistic way to look at things. You know, they are very much aware that if they don't dominate, it's dominate or be exterminated. That's how they see things, in this very dualistic way. That's really the main problem in the mind frame of these people who are the leaders of Israel. They have the sense that they have to finally rule the Middle East, and that's biblical too, you know. And one illustration, in my view, of how biblical is the neocons project is the famous theme of the 7 nations. I found incredibly revealing that Wesley Clark, you know, this famous general whose father is actually a certain rabbi, Jacob Kane. So Wesley Clark, he's the one who mentioned, you know, that he said that he went to the Pentagon one time and he met people close to Wolfowitz, and they said to him, they showed him a paper and they said, look, we are going to invade 7 nations. And he repeated these 7 nations again and again. And it's very funny because the 7 nations are a biblical theme, very well known by all Jewish people. They are the 7 enemies of Israel that Yahweh wants to be destroyed. Yahweh in Deuteronomy 7 and the book of Joshua also. You have this call, Yahweh is calling for the destruction, the eradication of these 7 enemy nations. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Wesley Clark, brought up this 7-nation theme. In fact, he was not the only one to mention 7 nations. I think George Bush, in one of his early speeches on September 2022, maybe, mentioned the seven nations as the rogue states. The rogue states. Of course, he mentioned in those nations that some countries that Israel is not interested into, like North Korea. But the very idea of targeting 7 nations, in my view, is an Israeli signature, because the more you study the mind of these people who are absolutely dedicated, whether by religious conviction or by some different kind of conviction, but as I say, it doesn't make much difference, are absolutely convinced that Israel is destined to become the new center of the new world order. This is a theme that you find expressed here and there. And one thing I like to remind, which I find really incredibly revealing, is that even David Ben-Gurion, because David Ben-Gurion is really the soul of Israel. Israelis recognize him as the father of the nation. In 1962, David Ben-Gurion was very, very afraid for his newly found country, and he struggled with Kennedy, as people who have studied the question know about. He wanted to convince Kennedy to turn his eyes away from the fact that Israel was building a nuclear bomb, and he felt it was actually vital, absolutely necessary for Israel to have the nuclear weapon. Otherwise, Israel would not survive the attacks of all its enemies. So he was absolutely in a state of mind of fearing for the existence of his country. And at the very same time, in 1962, he gave this very famous interview for the magazine Look. And the question that this magazine was asking a few people was, how do you see the world in 25 years? And he said, well, in 25 years, the United Nations will not exist anymore, and a new center of the world, a new United Nations, will be based in Jerusalem. Isn't that extraordinary? This incredible confidence of a country that had been created just 20 years before. He had this vision that finally Israel will be in 25 years. I mean, it's still not realized, of course, but I'm truly convinced this is a real deep conviction of many Israeli leaders. And I find it very biblical because I make a parallel with the biblical story of the creation of the Jewish monarchy in Palestine, with the blessing and the protection of the Persian Empire at the time of Ezra. If you read the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, you understand very clearly that at this point, the community of influential Jewish people around Ezra and this kind of rich, influential Jews in Persia managed to get permission from the Persian Empire to create a new state in Palestine. And they recreated, maybe they just created, in fact, it's a question of debate, because they went there and they claimed this is our land, this is a Jewish land, but most people who were living there didn't really like their ideas so much, so they had a lot of difficulty to rebuild their temple and so on. But I see that as the biblical pattern of the way Zionist or proto-Zionist, in that case, want to use the dominant empire and hijack the empire's foreign policy to get the empire to protect and help them create their nation in Palestine. I find a very interesting parallel between the foundation of Israel in 1947-48 and this biblical pattern. The point is, the goal is always to hijack the foreign and military policy of the empire. And the empire have changed throughout centuries. At that time it was Persia. Much later, it became the Spanish Empire or the Roman Empire, and Roman Empire, of course, first, and then later the Catholic Empire, and then it became the British Empire, and they used the British Empire to get the Balfour Declaration and to make the first foundation stone of their state, etc. And then, of course, for the last almost 100 years or 80 years at least, the dominant empire is the United States. So the neocons policy or strategy is to use the empire for in fact, with the goal of creating a new empire. And when their new empire will be created, of course, the fate of the American empire will be sealed. And we are starting to see that. But of course, everything is not going according to plan, fortunately.
Laurent Guyenot, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie.
I've been speaking with Laurent Guyenot. Today's show has been 9/11, a double false flag? Laurent Guyenot is an author, researcher, and journalist. His current research focuses on the religious and civilizational backgrounds of Zionist geostrategy. His books include Jesus and John the Baptist, Historical Inquiry into a Legendary Encounter, Fairy Death, An Anthropology of Medieval Fantasy, and translated into English, JFK to 9/11, 50 Years of Deep State, and From Yahweh to Zion, Jealous God, Chosen People, Promised Land, Clash of Civilizations. Laurent Guyenot has a degree in engineering, a master's in biblical studies, and pursued his interests in the history and anthropology of religions, earning his doctorate in medieval studies. His articles are posted at unz.com. That's unz.com. Guns and Butter is produced by Bonnie Faulkner, Yarrow Mako, and Tony Rango. Visit us at gunsandbutter.org to listen to past programs, comment on shows, or join our email list to receive our newsletter that includes recent shows and updates. Email us at faulkner@gunsandbutter.org. Follow us on Twitter at GNB Radio.